This is a political cartoon I'm quite fond of, which displays the evolution of the American empire through the life cycle of an increasingly rotund Uncle Sam. The journey of this nation from a scrappy young upstart to a gluttonous imperial power. President Donald Trump has always used nostalgia as a central part of his political rhetoric, with his Make America Great Again slogan serving as a vague allusion to some amorphous past. Perhaps the most concrete reading of this play to nostalgia would place it somewhere in the 1950s. That era commonly associated with nuclear families and post-war prosperity that saw the United States become a global hegemon, but prior to the significant social progress and cultural upheaval of the 1960s. Following the Second World War, the United States stepped into the spotlight of the world stage. The old powers of Europe were ravaged and needed to rebuild, but the US was entering an era of unprecedented prosperity, where it became the leader of the free world, so to speak. The world's policeman, protecting its own interests and sphere of influence across the globe. This is the most prevalent story of American global power, but it isn't what the cartoon is portraying. In fact, it's from nearly half a century earlier, 1899, but it's more relevant now than ever. The second Trump administration feels separate from that post-war period he so often alluded to in his rhetoric. It channels a different era of American power, one that few Americans even know much about, let alone feel nostalgia for. And that is the dawn of the American empire, under the presidency of William McKinley. The 25th president isn't someone who's brought up very often in popular culture. Trump made a much more explicit effort to tie himself to Andrew Jackson during his first administration, through his legacy of populism and fighting for the common man. McKinley is often overshadowed by the gregarious young VP who would replace him upon his assassination. He came into office at the tail end of the Gilded Age as a business-friendly Republican with protectionist trade policy and expansionist foreign policy, two elements that are certainly worth exploring given our current political situation. I would argue that the Spanish-American War, which occurred during McKinley's time in office, and to which he is closely associated, has the largest disparity of any American conflict between its impact on our history and how often we discuss it in popular culture. Much is made today about the democratization of media, how expanded means of communication has given a voice to an unprecedented amount of people. Perhaps what is even more covered, however, are the negative consequences of this surge in communication. If anyone has the ability to say anything on the internet, then logically you would be able to find some sort of reassurance for any argument, regardless of how ridiculous that argument may be. This has led to a rise in discussion of political echo chambers, where the media one consumes is tailored to not challenge their worldviews and simply reinforce their previously held beliefs. However, the way that we speak about the democratization of media is actually remarkably old. Concerns about echo chambers in some form or another have existed dating back at least to the printing press. For as much as we romanticize the good old days of Walter Cronkite and the three major news networks that were fairly indistinguishable from each other, the reality of the history of journalism is far more complex. You'll find that sensationalism and misinformation far predate our current media landscape, especially around the time of the Spanish-American War. By imagining the past as a simpler time, we do them and ourselves the disservice of seeing those who came before us as somehow less complex than we are, when in reality they had just as many thoughts, feelings, aspirations, and shortcomings as any of us alive today. History is of course written by the victors, but I find it important to examine not only what happened in this country's history, but the debates surrounding the issues of the day. In the latter half of the 1800s, political cartoons were all the rage in magazines and newspapers as a fun and clever way to convey an opinion to the public. America's war against Spain represented the dawn of the American empire, a fundamental reconception in what this country was, a true turning point in our history. The controversy surrounding the war inspired an abundance of political cartoons, which are fascinating to examine from a modern perspective. This anti-imperialist illustration by Victor Gillam, published in 1895, presents a map of this continent in the shape of the patriotic Uncle Sam about to devour the small Cuban fish that just can't seem to get away. Maybe this is how he got so large in the other cartoon. Uncle Sam is, of course, one of the most iconic personifications of the United States, whose likeness became a staple of American cartoonists throughout the 1800s. While Columbia, another personification of this country, could serve as an angelic guide leading the pioneers across the continent, the lack of subtlety in Uncle Sam's appearance made him much easier to mock. The iconic symbol's lean frame, which had represented the scrappiness of the young nation, provided an opportunity for subversion for the eager cartoonist as conversations about US power became more prevalent. This cartoon, published in 1899, further reflects the era in which it was published through its use of the fat cat archetype. Not only is Uncle Sam drawn to be comically round, he is made to look like the caricatures of wealthy business cartoons throughout the Gilded Age, drawing an apparent parallel between the greed they exhibited over everyday Americans that would soon be reckoned with during the Progressive Era, with the greed that the United States had begun exhibiting in its foreign policy. However, this cartoon is actually in favor of American imperialism. It shows the United States as being strong and bountiful, with various other nations reaching out nervously to shake its hand and get on its good side. The excess and greed that we originally interpret in the image is instead intended to signify bountifulness and power. The evolution of the United States into a colonial power is just the next logical step in its progression. Looking through more drawings, you'll notice that food and weight continue to be a common theme. This illustration shows Uncle Sam eagerly choosing between a menu of US colonial pursuits, such as Cuba steak and Puerto Rico pig, while a sinister-looking McKinley serves as the waiter taking his order, looking a suspicious amount like Colin Farrell's penguin. Alas, the entire scheme was simply a ruse to fatten up Uncle Sam and bolster William McKinley's tailoring business, where he drapes the iconic American with enlightened foreign policy and rational expansion as medicine men offer anti-expansionist policy as an elixir, in this cartoon titled Declined with Thanks. The history of the United States is very often that of a struggle between isolationism and internationalism. All the way back during the administration of George Washington, there was a great debate on whether or not we should support revolutionary France against the British, as they had done for us during our own revolution, or stay away from European entanglements altogether, where Washington ultimately chose neutrality. This illustration depicts Uncle Sam stretching his legs from Alaska to the very edge of South America, wielding a bat that reads Monroe Doctrine, 1824 to 1905. This refers to the framework established by President James Monroe that put forth the Americas as a distinct sphere of influence separate from the Europeans, rejecting the influence and imperial pursuits of the Old World in the Western Hemisphere, and seeking to establish relationships with independent Latin American nations. As American power grew, the Monroe Doctrine came to be used as justification for intervention. In the 3 years prior to the Spanish-American War, Cuban revolutionaries had been fighting for their freedom against their colonial overlords. Many in the United States wanted the government to intervene, both out of a desire to expand American power in the Western Hemisphere and a genuine concern with Spain's mistreatment of the Cuban people. Political cartoons played an extraordinary role in shaping the American public's perception of the situation. This cartoon, published in the magazine Puck, shows a personification of Cuba being cooked by Spanish misrule over the fires of anarchy. The duty of the hour, to save her not only from Spain, but from a worse fate. You might be familiar with the term yellow journalism, a popular phrase from the 19th century that signified exaggerated or sensational reporting. Well, there was a significant amount of yellow journalism on both sides of this issue. So much so that this image features McKinley diligently reading his war policy, while the shabbily dressed newspaper man Joseph Pulitzer pokes his long, lying nose into it while carrying his own yellow journal. This other Puck magazine cover shows McKinley McKinley as calmly above the fray as Pulitzer and a monkey version of newspaperman William Randolph Hearst are stuck in the mud with one another. The United States would eventually, of course, declare war on Spain following the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, an explosion that bears very little evidence of having been the result of foul play by the Spanish, but one that they were blamed for nonetheless. During the era of William McKinley, there was still a strong isolationist movement in this country that opposed the president's foreign policy. On the other side of the coin, this cartoon, titled The White Man's Burden, Apologies to Rudyard Kipling, which shows a more traditional Uncle Sam accompanied by his British counterpart John Bull, carrying terribly racist caricatures of different countries towards civilization while overcoming barbarism, ignorance, and oppression without the slightest sense of irony. Each racist caricature also features labels designating them with any of either country's respective colonial holdings of the era, just in case you were confused. The title of the cartoon is of course in reference to the famous 1899 poem by Kipling, advocating for a paternalistic imperialism that places on the shoulders of the civilized white folks of the Western world the noble burden of educating the inferior races. A piece that future President Theodore Roosevelt referred to as rather poor poetry, but good sense from the expansion point of view. This same grotesque, paternalistic line of thinking was also used to justify slavery in the United States. This idea that the black man would be lost without the white man there to protect him, to guide him, and to give him honest work. Any benefit that the labor of those individuals bring to those who had enslaved them is, of course, merely a byproduct of the enslaver fulfilling their good Christian duty. The Bible's declaration that man should bring the earth under his dominion was a driving justification for manifest destiny, for the expansion of our hold over this continent. But where else can man bring under his dominion after we're done conquering this continent from sea to shining sea? Is it not also their duty, by that logic, to spread that knowledge to all other inferior peoples of the world? While we've certainly harped on good old Uncle Sam, the less jingoistic Lady Columbia is not without her unfavorable portrayals. This illustration, published in 1901, features Miss America getting ready in front of a mirror dressed in patriotic attire, complete with a battleship-shaped bonnet crowning her a world power while blowing the smoke of expansion. This cartoon illustrates just how significant of a step the United States was taking onto the world stage. It was remarkable, the speed in which this scrappy young country would go from obtaining its status alongside the great powers of the old world to becoming the preeminent global superpower in the coming decades, the most powerful nation in the history of the world. To think of the drastic ways in which this country changed in the short 100 years between 1900 and 2000 is to truly understand the 20th century as the American century. While the United States today is a much more powerful nation than it was in the time of McKinley, the outright imperialism of the dawn of the 20th century is blunt and direct in a way that feels alien to our modern sensibilities. Critics of the Iraq War can cite arguments about American adventurism, nation building, and the spread of democracy. But the idea that we would conquer foreign terrain and bring it under our dominion was completely out of the question. The United States has a great history of territorial expansion, one that is painted both by triumph and by tragedy. There's certainly something appealing about the idea of growing the borders of the United States, of for the first time in decades expanding its presence on a map. Trump's fixation on William McKinley raises some interesting questions about his worldview, how he conceives of American power, and what his goals are in the second administration. I don't know if we're shifting the Overton window back to one of American expansionism, but just the thought of that, the bluntness with which he approaches a situation is unlike anything we've seen in this country in the last few decades of the liberal world order. And how it ends, none of us can know yet for sure. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching. There's some really amazing political cartoons from that era that I wasn't able to include in this video because of time, so if you would like to see me cover any more of those, please feel free to leave a like, leave a comment down below, and maybe I could do a sort of part 2 if that's something that you guys are interested in. As always, a special thank you to our patrons and channel members who make the work that I do here possible. You can support for as little as $1 a month, you get early access to videos, and your name will be featured in the credits like you see right here. We also have an official Discord for the channel where you can join and continue the conversations that we have right here in these videos. It's been a lot of fun talking to you guys there, and I would love to see some more people. You can also just let me know what other kind of videos you'd like to see here on the channel. Once again, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.